Welcome to Summarizing the Classics, the channel where classic books are summarized in a modern way.
Oh, you fancy.
Today's video is all about The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This classic was written in 1891. The Picture of Dorian Gray was ahead of its time, though a lot of homoerotic subtext was taken out because it was not deemed appropriate in Victorian England.
It was a different time.
Which is why the book starts with a preface from Mr. Wilde, which can be summarized by these lines. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all.
He has a point.
Then the story begins. Man about town, Lord Henry Wotton, is visiting his friend, painter Basil Hallward. Basil is working on a painting of a man Lord Henry describes as an Adonis who looks as if he was made out of ivory and roses.
Tell me more!
Basil tells him the man's name is Dorian Gray, and that he inspired him to make this painting, the best he's ever made. Basil waxes poetically about Dorian, so Lord Henry wants to meet him. As luck would have it, the butler announces that Dorian has arrived. Still, Basil is hesitant to introduce the two.
I really don't trust you.
He says that Dorian has a simple and beautiful nature and warns Lord Henry not to influence him, before eventually introducing the two. While Basil paints Dorian's portrait further, Lord Henry starts up a conversation. A conversation that will change Dorian's life. He praises hedonism and tells Dorian that the only way to get rid of temptation is to give in to it. He bemoans the terror of society, morals and religion, which he says have made people afraid. Dorian notices that these words stir something in him.
Never thought about it like that.
Lord Henry says that beauty is a form of genius, but better because you don't have to explain it. He then tells Dorian that his beauty is the wonder of wonders and that he could use it to charm the world. He warns him to hold on to his youth. He tells the impressed Dorian that when his youth goes, his beauty will go with it and there will be no triumphs left for him.
That's so harsh.
Harsh, but true.
He explains that he has to tell him this because he can see that Dorian is unaware of his beauty and charm and he doesn't want him to waste it. Dorian's worldview is shifting because of Lord Henry's words, and suddenly he sees everything in a different light. When Basil shows him his portrait, it's as if he sees his own beauty for the first time. Then Dorian exclaims how sad it is that the picture will stay young as he grows old and horrible. He then says the life-changing words, "If only it were I who was to always be young and the picture that was to grow old, I would give my soul for that." "This is your doing, Harry," Basil then says bitterly.
This is not going to end well.
The next day, Lord Henry talks to some friends about Dorian. They know his family and tell him that his mother was a gorgeous girl from a rich family. When she married a poor boy, her father was furious and paid to have him killed. She died a year later, leaving Dorian an orphan to be raised by his rich and cold grandfather. Lord Henry is fascinated.
He's a very interesting man.
Lord Henry and Dorian start up a friendship, and when Dorian visits him a month after their first meeting, he lets him know that he's in love. Lord Henry told him that the search for beauty is the real secret of life, so Dorian decided to go to the theater. There he fell in love with actress Sybil Vane. Not only did her beauty bring tears to his eyes, he tells Harry, he also loved watching her perform, calling her a genius. Harry agrees to watch Sybil perform soon. A few hours after the visit, Harry gets a note informing him that Dorian and Sybil have just gotten engaged. Then we catch a glimpse of Sybil's life. She is deliriously in love with Dorian, which worries her mother and brother. They don't have much money, Sybil's theater job is an important source of income, and she barely knows this Prince Charming, as she calls him. They are worried that he's using her, and in typical brother fashion, he swears he'll kill Dorian if he hurts her. But Sybil trusts Dorian completely and is on cloud 9.
I love him. I do.
But when Dorian, Lord Henry and Basil watch Sybil perform in Romeo and Juliet a few days later, the disappointment is palpable. Though she is still beautiful, her acting is terrible. She is so wooden on stage that half the audience walks out.
That was embarrassing.
Dorian is mortified. After the play, he visits Sybil backstage. She explains joyfully that her acting was so bad because now that she knows what real love feels like, acting it out seemed hollow and empty. He angrily tells her that he isn't in love with her anymore. He says that he thought she had genius and intellect, but now he sees how shallow and stupid she is. Without your art, you are nothing, he yells at the trembling Sybil. She pleads with him to give her another chance, but he rejects her and leaves.
That was harsh.
When he gets home, he notices Basil's portrait of himself, which was a gift to him. Something has changed in his expression. Like there's suddenly a touch of cruelty in the mouth. The next morning it seems to have gotten worse. He looks in the mirror, but nothing has changed in his actual face. Suddenly he remembers what he'd said all those weeks ago. If only it were I who was to always be young and the picture that was to grow old, I would give my soul for that. He realizes it's the hurt he's caused Sybil that changed his portrait. Every sin he commits will show up on the painting, but not on his face. Everything that ages a person will never age him. Dorian feels awful and decides to marry her after all. He never wants to speak to Lord Henry again since their conversation caused this.
I'm done with the bad boys.
But the next day, while he's writing a letter of apology to Sybil, Lord Henry stops by. He tells him that Sybil took her own life right after Dorian left, and her passing is in all the newspapers. Since nobody knows he's involved, Henry advises him to stay out of it. Dorian is devastated. Henry calms Dorian by playing on his ego. He tells him the marriage would have made him bored and miserable. He calls the tragedy beautiful and tells Dorian she took her life for the love of you. He brings it home by saying she died just like the heroines she portrayed on stage. Dorian decides that Henry is right and it's not a big deal.
That's so messed up.
Afterwards, he realizes he can take full advantage of the portrait's opportunity. He will live a life of passion, pleasure, sin, and infinite youth. The portrait will bear the burden. It will be his secret though, so he puts a screen in front of it. When Basil visits him the next day and finds him unaffected by Sybil's death, he confronts Dorian about his behavior. But Dorian repeats the words Lord Henry has said to him as if they were his own. And Basil realizes it's too late. Henry's influence changed Dorian.
Yeah, I saw that coming.
Still, Basil asks to see his portrait of him. Dorian freaks out. He obviously doesn't want Basil to see the changes the painting has undergone. Basil is taken aback by this frantic reaction, as he was hoping to use it for an exhibit. He mistakenly assumes that Dorian feels uncomfortable because he saw the adoration he has for him in the painting. Embarrassed, Basil confesses that he worshipped Dorian while working together and that he put those feelings into the portrait. Dorian allows him to think this is the reason no one can see the painting. He tells the ashamed painter there's no need to worship him and they should just remain friends.
Ouch.
After Basil leaves, Dorian decides to take the portrait to the attic, away from visitors. That day, Lord Henry sends him a book that Dorian will obsess over for years to come. It's about a man who tries every passion, trend, sin, and even spiritual path that catches his fancy. Dorian sees him as both a sinner and a saint and relates to him. He likes to read the ending, in which the character loses everything over time, knowing that he will keep his beauty and charm, and for him it will only be lost in the painting. In the following years, Dorian enjoys everything that life has to offer a man like him. Rumors circulate about his lifestyle and his notorious absences. He is able to counteract them with his charm and popular dinner parties. Men want to be like him and women want to be with him. Though people do notice that all the women he's intimate with seem to shun him later and are embarrassed that they defied social convention for him. Dorian doesn't seem to care.
I'm having the time of my life.
He travels the world, running in both high society and dangerous places. He devotes himself to many ways of life, but only for a while. Like Roman Catholicism, mysticism, and Darwinism. He also studies things like perfumes, music, and jewels. He goes to any country to buy the rarest jewel or instrument, only to grow bored of it when something else catches his eye. After his travels, he goes to the attic and looks at the aging face and misshapen body in the portrait and the healthy, beautiful person in the mirror. At times, he can't sleep thinking of how ugly the portrait's becoming, symbolizing the ruin on his soul. But those moments are rare.
Why dwell on these negative themes?
Then, on his 38th birthday, Basil stops by. He's been hearing strange rumors about Dorian for years and wants to know the truth. Why do his friendships with young men always end terribly? There was the one who committed suicide, one who had to leave the country, one whose career was ruined. And what about Lord Henry's sister, whose children aren't even allowed to see her since her affair with Dorian? And why is he seen creeping out of the foulest places in London? He wonders if Dorian is capable of these things, but of course he can't see his soul. "You can see it tonight," yells an angry Dorian. Basil follows him to the attic.
Yeah, this seems like a really bad idea.
He is shocked when he sees how monstrous his painting has become, a hideous old face with a disgusting grin. Dorian explains what happened and Basil begs him to pray together. Maybe if he repents, it will change things. Dorian looks at the painting and feels a surge of intense hatred for Basil. He grabs a knife and kills him. Afterwards, he feels oddly calm and invites over an old friend, Alan Campbell, who's a chemist. He blackmails him to get rid of Basil's body.
It's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it.
Nonetheless, his conscience starts to weigh on him. He's restless, sad, and Basil keeps popping up in his mind. The painting now has a gleam of red on his hands. Dorian needs a relief, so he visits an opium den. There he runs into an old friend who spends his days there and is ousted by his family. Dorian was the cause of this decline, and he suddenly feels so bad that he has to leave. But not before a woman says that she heard he likes to be called Prince Charming. A drunken sailor named James hears this and runs after Dorian. James attacks him and tells him Sybil Vane was his sister. He recognized the Prince Charming pet name she used to call him and wants to kill him to avenge her. Dorian convinces him that he has the wrong man. This was long ago and he's still young. Looking at his boyish, pretty face, James decides he's right and lets him go. But then the woman from the opium den comes out of the shadows and tells him Dorian is the right guy. He ruined her life 18 years ago as well.
That's what he does. That's all he does.
In the next few days, Dorian realizes James Vane is following him. He is sick with anxiety, but fate helps him once again. While Dorian is hunting with friends, one of them accidentally shoots James, who was hiding in the grass. So Dorian decides to do good from now on. Lord Henry laughs at this plan, saying that they are the same and they won't change. In passing, they also talk about Basil's disappearance and Alan Campbell's recent suicide. But though he is to blame for both, Dorian doesn't care. He is consumed by the thought of that ugly painting, the representation of his conscience. When he gets home, he decides to get rid of it. Then he will be free.
Start a new life, pretend like it never happened.
He stabs the painting with a knife. His servants hear a scream and find the portrait as it used to be, with Dorian's youthful, unspoiled face on it. Before it lies the body of an ugly old man with a knife in his heart. It's only by his rings that they recognize him as Dorian.